I'm Jennifer Homendy, and I'm a board member with the National Transportation Safety Board. Thank you for joining our celebration of NTSB's 50 years of advocacy for positive train control. Many of you watching probably know what positive train control is. Some of you may not. So simply put, PTC is life-saving technology designed to automatically stop a train before certain accidents occur. Our efforts towards PTC began in 1970 when we issued our first recommendation as a result of a head-on collision of two Penn Central trains in Darien, Connecticut 1 year earlier. That collision tragically took the lives of 3 crew members and 1 passenger and injured about 40 others. Over the next 5 decades, we investigated one crash after another that could have been prevented had PTC been implemented. In total, we've investigated 154 accidents that took the lives of 305 people and injured 6,883 others. Most memorable for me were 2 commuter rail crashes in Placentia and Chatsworth, California, 2 chlorine tank car releases in McDonough, Texas, and Graniteville, South Carolina, and significant tragedies in Chase, Maryland, Boston, Massachusetts, Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, and DuPont, Washington. In 1990, we issued our first most wanted list of transportation safety improvements, and PTC was on it. The most wanted list is our primary advocacy tool to bring enhanced focus on vital transportation safety issues and recommendations that, if implemented, will prevent crashes and injuries and save lives. Unfortunately, we'd have to wait another 30 years until we'd finally see PTC implemented. But with each crash and investigation, we were more emboldened to fight harder for PTC. Many times we were fighting alone. And we're going to talk about that today. Fortunately, we never give up. And on December 18th, 2020, the last railroad required by Congress to implement PTC met the mandate. That's a huge win for safety and a huge win for the NTSB. And personally, it means a great deal to me because I've worked a majority of my career to make PTC a reality. Too often, we don't take the time to pause and celebrate our success and reflect back on our hard work. 2020 was a tough year for all of us, and the first few weeks of 2021 have been equally challenging. We wanted to put something together that was more uplifting for members and staff and for the public. And honestly, we probably would have celebrated this privately with some cake in my office. But we thought you'd enjoy a somewhat behind the scenes, candid reflection on all our work. So for the first hour, I'm going to chat with our current chairman, Robert Sumwalt, who has served on the board since 2006. He's been the chairman since 2017. We're also going to talk to 3 former chairs, Debbie Hersman, who served on the board from 2004 to 2014, including nearly 5 years as chair. Chris Hart, who served on the board for 11 years, first from 1990 to 1993, and then again from 2009 to 2017, serving as chair for over 3 years. And Jim Hall, who was on the board from 1993 to 2001, serving as chair for nearly 7 years, almost his entire tenure on the board. Knowingly, or more likely unknowingly, all 4 of them have served as mentors for me as I've worked on transportation safety issues my entire career. We're then going to turn to a discussion with staff so you can hear from those who work behind the scenes on our investigations and our safety recommendations. But before we begin, I want to thank some key staff who did a lot of work to put this together. It doesn't just come together easily. It takes a lot of work leading up to today. And first, I want to recognize Nick Worrell, who runs Safety Advocacy. We're going to meet Eric Weiss and James Anderson later. I want to thank Eric Strickland in my office. And then from the technical side, I want to thank Carl Perkins, Kelly Romeo, and Deidre Esters. But most importantly, I really want to recognize a key person who helped put this together, and that's Leah Walton from our Safety Advocacy Office. And maybe Leah, if you could bring up your camera. There she is. Leah has been in our Safety Advocacy Office for 5 years and just did a tremendous amount of work putting this together. So thank you so much for doing everything you did. And now I want to invite all the chairs, who I am going to call by first name because it's very hard to go chairman, 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 chairman. Please turn on your cameras. Please unmute. And let me start with some opening remarks from each of you. Let's start with Robert.
Well, Jennifer, thank you so much. I really do want to thank you for your leadership on this very important issue of positive train control. In a former life, of course, you were the staff director of the House Rail Subcommittee, and I don't think you're very modest, but I think it's important to give credit where credit is due. As I understand it, you were a key drafter of the legislation that went on to become the Rail Safety Improvement Act, which mandated PTC. So thank you for your leadership there, but you've continued to carry that mantle once you came to the NTSB by continuing to push for it, and it culminates today with this celebration. So thank you, Jennifer, for all you're doing, all you have done and continue to do. And I'll say this, it's a pleasure to be back with Chris and Debbie. I've had the pleasure of serving with them and serving under their leadership. And although I never served with Jim Hall, Jim, I say this with all love, I certainly feel like I'm serving with you because you don't mind picking up the phone and giving me advice. But I do appreciate it. So it's great to be here. Thank you, Jennifer, and thank everyone for being here.
Thanks, Robert. Chris?
I want to second that. Thank you, Jennifer, for setting this up, for arranging this. What a great idea this is. The opportunity to do this with four other chairs is wonderful as well. And I have to say that the real thanks foundationally goes to Congress, who created an advocacy agency like the NTSB that was created to be apolitical, was created to respond to the realities and not the politics. And that was a great move that they put 5 members from only 3 from the president's party, so that it's not a Republican thing or a Democratic thing. And this is actually one of the few agencies that requires some relevant background and expertise in order to serve in this capacity. And we have done that uniformly, and that has helped improve transportation safety in so many ways. And I have to tell you, it's up close and personal for all of us because we all fly and we all ride on trains and we all drive. And so it's up close and personal for all of us. And what a great opportunity this is for us to move this needle in a way that has resulted in accomplishing this PTC goal that started 50 years ago. So kudos to Congress for setting us up the way we did, and kudos to all of the people who have served on the NTSB to help Congress accomplish what it wanted to by creating the NTSB. So thanks again for setting this up, and thanks for including me in it.
Great comments. Debbie?
Thank you for convening this discussion, Member Homendy, and it's great to be with such an illustrious group of members and staff today. Like you, Jennifer, my engagement with the NTSB on PTC predated my time on the board, and it actually remains part of our family today. Chairman Hall will remember the 1996 MARC Amtrak collision in Silver Spring. 3 MARC crew members were killed and 8 Job Corps students who actually survived the initial impact but could not escape the burning train, even though people watched helplessly from the outside, were a part of that tragic event. I worked for Congressman Wise, who was ranking member on that same railroad subcommittee that we've just mentioned. And while NTSB at that time, again, recommended what they called at the time positive train separation control systems, they also made recommendations that within a few years led to improved locomotive crashworthiness and safer passenger rail car design. From that experience, I learned how powerful it was when NTSB investigations were coupled with public and political pressure. Important safety improvements could be made for an entire industry. And that legacy that remains for my family stems from a PTC preventable crash between two CN trains in Mississippi that I launched to in the summer of 2005. I was 7 months pregnant, and the closest city, Jackson, is the name of my 15-year-old son.
Wow, great comments. Mr. Hall.
Yeah, Jennifer, thank you so much for the opportunity to participate in this and also the outstanding work you did for Chairman Jim Oberstar, who was one of the great champions of transportation safety. My grandfather was a railroad conductor for the L&N Railroad. And in my home state of Tennessee, more than 100 years ago, the worst train accident in American history occurred. More than 100 people were killed, and when two trains collided at a place called Dutchman's Curve outside of Nashville near Belle Meade. I think that's one mark we want to remember today. But we also need to remember that more than 50 years ago, Americans landed safely on the moon. Quite a technological achievement. Finally, after the Dutchman's Curve accident 102 years ago, and 50 years after landing on the moon, we have a National Train Control System, PTC, installed on high-risk scheduled passenger mainline track service, and also on routes used to transport poisonous by inhalation gases like chlorine, which was released in the horrible accident at Graniteville, South Carolina in 2005. It took initiatives by the National Transportation Safety Board, the chairman and staff that existed at the time I served, Debbie served, and Bob and Chris, but also going back to Jim Burnett, Colstead, all the way back into the 70s, to be persistent on this safety issue. And it took mandates from Congress to finally direct the railroads to push developments and investments to meet the mandate for positive train control. But we need to remember, like the tombstone mentality that has been demonstrated in the aviation and other industries, it took tragic accidents like the Chatsworth, California accident with 25 dead to finally move the industry forward. This is an important discussion and one that we all commit to the memory of those individuals who lost their lives in these fatalities.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. And with that, I do want to recognize the Robert. It's going to be hard for me not to call you chairman here, but Robert, for a quick announcement before I start in with so many questions.
Jennifer, indeed, we have a very exciting announcement. The board, 5 of us, have unanimously adopted closing out 3 PTC-related safety recommendations. And I think anytime we can successfully close a recommendation, that is a victory for safety.
That is a big victory. And so I'm going to, and big news. So I'm actually extremely excited that you announced that. So thank you. I want to start with the first question, and that's what was a watershed moment for each of you during your time at the NTSB on PTC? We can start again with Robert, and then anyone can chime in.
Well, I'll tell you what, I'd rather go last on this one, and I do certainly have some thoughts on that. But why don't we let one of the others go first?
All right, I'll pick on Debbie.
I would say the highlight for me was the passage of the Rail Safety Improvement Act, which mandated in 2008 that positive train control be implemented by 2015. The disappointment was when the 5-year extension was passed, extending the implementation deadline.
Chris or Jim? Chris, you're on mute.
Thank you. Eternal optimist that I am, my enthusiasm was continued by virtue of so many other improvements in railroads that have occurred that affect me personally because I'm a passenger. For example, I can remember as a kid going from Denver to Salina, Kansas on the Union Pacific Railroad, how much I loved riding on trains. And I can remember those windows must have been an inch thick, and there's no way you're going to get out of that car if you have to. And the reason they have emergency escapes is because of of NTSB recommendations. That it used to be just a tray on the top of the car to put your bags, and so if you had a sudden stop, those bags could become deadly missiles. But it's because of NTSB recommendations. It traces back to them that there are partitions on the baggage tray so that the bags don't just fly away. The hot coffee pot, the fact that it's as secure as it is now, is attributable to NTSB recommendations. The fact that when you see passenger trains derail, they almost never decouple because the couplers were much stronger because people realized that if the cars stay coupled, they're less likely to roll over. That was attributable to NTSB recommendations. So there were so many bits and pieces of it that gave me a lot of encouragement that we are going to also move this positive train control needle. And it was happening in slow steps, to be sure. I have to say that I was wondering whether the industry was trying to make it tougher than it needed to be, because when I went to the Transportation Test Center where they test trains in Pueblo, Colorado, they explained to me about positive train control, and oh yeah, that's doable, and we just do this, we do that. When I come back to Washington, oh, that's tough, we can't do this. So I knew there was a dispute about how difficult this really was, but so many bits and pieces that I saw were coming together slowly but surely to tell me that sooner or later this goal was going to be met.
Jim.
Well, my memories on this particularly go back to Kelso, because that was the first accident that I launched on as a new member of the National Transportation Safety Board. I'd served in Vietnam and I'd seen tragedy, but seeing that accident and then as chairman, having that accident report come to the board that I presided over in November of '94 was significant, because I was very aware by that time of the work that had been done under previous chairmen and previous boards on this particular issue. And so we wanted to reinforce the board's position, and in that we made recommendations. I posted this on my LinkedIn website for anyone who's interested. But we asked the railroads to do train control demonstration projects, which they did do. Each of the railroads that was involved in that accident in that corridor. And as a result of that, we also asked the AAR, the Association of American Railroad, to try and identify and evaluate the potential benefits of positive train separation. And then the work was done, as Chris mentioned, at down in Pueblo, Colorado. But the one thing that frustrated me the most was that, if you can imagine our air traffic control system, where each airline was trying to run their own system, the thing that really put the brakes on positive train control, and it made it drag so long, was that each one of the railroads was trying to come up with their own technology rather than cooperatively working together. The other memory I have, of course, is the one I share with Debbie, and that is Silver Spring. I went out to Silver Spring. Obviously, it's just a short trip from the Washington headquarters. And there are a couple of things that'll always stick with me, and that's the pipeline accident in Bellingham and the 3 young men that lost their lives in that accident, and the Silver Spring accident, in which these young people who were trying, part of a program to advance their own abilities and education, were unable to get out off of this car because they didn't have a coin to open the emergency exit. So a lot of progress has been made, and I'm glad we have this opportunity, Jennifer, thanks to you, to talk about it.
Robert.
Yeah, and I've been on scene, board member on scene for 4 PTC preventable accidents. And I think, and I've certainly been involved in the deliberation and determination of probable cause on many. And I'm guessing that probably the first one that I deliberated would have been Anding. Of course, as Debbie mentioned, that accident was in 2005. But by the time it came to the board, I was already on the board. But and so there've been numerous accident investigations that I've been involved in, not board member on scene. I'd say the most dramatic of those, and I'm not trying to say that one was worse than the other, but the one with the most fatalities, of course, was the Amtrak 188 at Philadelphia. That was a case where an engineer was attempting to go around a curve at 106 miles an hour, where the speed limit at that curve was 50. 8 fatalities, unfortunately, and it got a lot of media attention. And so, anyway.
Yeah, and we're gonna actually that's a great segue into one of the questions I had, which was, in whether it doesn't often matter on significance, but it can matter. For Philly 188, there was a tremendous amount of media attention, and there were lawmakers who came. And in fact, I came up with Chairman Denham and Ranking Member Capuano. I know Chairman Schuster was there and his staff. But you had the mayor and others, and for all of you, that's something that you have to contend with on scene. And we'll get into the family aspect a little bit later. But why don't you talk about that?
I've been on 36 accidents. The first was my training accident with Debbie Hersman, the Comair accident. I'd been on the board for 7 days when that one occurred. So in addition to that one, I've been board member on scene. I was board member on scene for 35 accidents, altogether 36, including Comair. I would say that of all of those, with maybe the exception of Debbie's launch to Comair, Amtrak 188 was by far the biggest media event that I've ever heard. You've got a train that's leaving from Washington, D.C. So there's big media interest there. It's going to New York City. Big media interest there. It happens in another very big metropolitan city. Big media interest there. It very quickly became a national story. And I think it's not about me, of course, but I've never done so many media interviews in my life, including coming home. And Chris Hart allowed me to do this because once you leave, the chairman is the spokesperson. But Chris, thank you for allowing me to do it, or whatever, but I ended up doing all five Sunday morning shows, which is a fairly unusual event to talk about this event. I think that exemplifies what a large media event it was.
Anyone else want to chime in on that?
I would say, just from my perspective, one of the great benefits of high visibility events is the opportunity for the NTSB to tell their story. And so, trying to get members of Congress interested in the recommendations, the reports, the issues can sometimes be challenging because they have a lot on their plate. And so if they come out and they see the work of the NTSB and they get to walk the scene with the board member, the investigator in charge, or some of the group chairmen and hear what they're looking at, I think it really helps to educate them and begin to help them to think about what their role is in trying to prevent something like this from happening. And so I would say there's certainly a lot of complexity. There's a lot of challenges when you've got various interests, political and public and media interests, that you've got to manage all of that. And I think you mentioned the family members, which you always want to try to be respectful of what the family members are going through first, before you're taking on all those other things. But it's a high pressure scene, but it's one of the most beneficial opportunities that the NTSB has to demonstrate their professionalism and the importance of what they do. And so I would say it can feel sometimes very heavy, but I think the opportunity is great.
Well, I'll comment if kind of waiting for Chris to see if we keep the same order, but I'll go out of order here. I think transparency in our investigations is the strength of our board and the strength of our public voice. And that has been amplified, I think, by the structure we have of the GO team and the media, and being able to involve and engage the public in what has occurred and the opportunity to follow it. While I was chairman, we were able to put in our communication center and our website so that literally anyone can go online and read any one of the NTSB investigations going back to the inception of the agency, as long as they were recorded. So that transparency is the way, I think, is the main problem that gets a lot of people in trouble, because they aren't transparent and open with the public, and particularly in a situation where we serve here. As far as my personal experience, the John F. Kennedy Jr. aviation accident was clearly the largest media event I ever participated in, because it would involve just not only national but international interest, worldwide interest in that particular tragedy.
So now I'll take my turn. And I have to say that what struck me in so many of the railroad accidents I went to was how fundamentally it's a human endeavor, and will be for a long time to come, and how important it is for any human endeavor to have a safety net for the times when the human isn't perfect. And even the best human will make mistakes on his or her best day. And that's, and even in Chatsworth, it wasn't even a mistake in Chatsworth. It was an intentional wrongdoing. The person on the cell phone texting when he should have been driving the train. But what struck me when in so many of those accidents was the importance, how essential it is to have a technological safety net for humans who make mistakes, because humans, even on their best day, will make mistakes. And another thing about railroads is how much it depends on memory. It's amazing to me that they're running this line and they memorize the speeds on the curve. So Philadelphia accident we're talking about, that engineer was distracted by a mishap on another train on the next track over, and he was offering assistance to that train. And in the course of all of that back and forth, I imagine he lost he was distracted from his memory task. And one of the memory tasks was, what's the speed limit on the upcoming curve? And so that's what PTC is all about, is the fact that humans, even on their best day, will make mistakes, and you need a technological a safety net to respond to that reality that humans, even on their best day, make mistakes, especially in a memory intense environment like railroads. I mean, those poor Amtrak engineers going from New York to Florida who are riding on other people's properties. Imagine my amazement to find out that the signals are different on everybody's property. So the signal that tells me I have to do X on one property is going to be different on another property. And the Amtrak engineers who are riding on other people's properties have to know all of those signals. In fact, I was talking to their training people, and when they talk about hiring engineers, they say even before they hire the engineer by the second time of taking the signal test has to get 100%, or else he or she is not hired. And all this in such an intense memory environment that you're memorizing what your next speed limits are. And so you ask, well, why don't they have speed limits posted? Well, because the speed limit would be different for the Acela train than it would be for the freight train, than it would be for the regular passenger train. So that would be a pretty complicated sign. And so speed limits are not generally posted. So it's a memory thing. And that engineer in Philadelphia was distracted by this tragic event on a parallel track. He was trying to offer some assistance, forgot what his next speed limit was, and was way over speed on the curb. So kudos to those who started the whole PTC move and who pressed it and kept it and wouldn't give up until it was accomplished.
Well, and I think when you talk about the train crew members, I have been a big champion for worker safety, for trying to strengthen worker safety over the years, because it's critically important. And with a lot of these accidents, you had one or two crew members who tragically passed away, or Jim, in the one in Kelso, you had 5 crew members. Debbie in Graniteville, you had a crew member. Actually, I just spoke to his father the other day, Chris Sealing's father the other day, who we were talking about the conclusion of PTC. And, it's tough when it comes to worker safety issues, because the public, in a lot of ways, it's a lot like traffic safety, where you might have 1 or 2 fatalities and the public kind of moves on. But for us, it's accident after accident after accident. And until something big happens, then you see everybody pay attention, which is so tough. I mean, what do you think about that? I mean, how do you deal with keeping the issue on the forefront when people aren't paying attention to the smaller accidents, but really focused on the big ones? I mean, Jim, you talked about the tombstone mentality. Chairman Obastar used to say that all the time, but it wasn't until the big ones and after the fact.
Well, the Office of Safety Recommendations certainly does a good job in trying to keep the recommendations of the board in and available to the public, as well as the most wanted list, which I believe it was Chairman Kolstad that initiated that some time ago, which was an effort for the board to try to re-emphasize recommendations that we thought had even, a major impact in the transportation industry. So it's a full-time job. Most interesting now, of course, is this particular webinar, or whatever you call these things. Back in the day, I can remember being at the Pittsburgh hearing when all the cameras left from the 3 networks at that time, plus CNN, and they were all going to follow the O.J. Simpson trial. At that time, we only had a small beeper for communications. So now for the board to morph into being sure that we're using this 24-hour media system and the technology through the internet to press forward our recommendations is an important thing.
Robert.
Yeah, Jennifer, I've heard you say it before, and I think your perspective is so important. Your question really was, how do we keep the issue alive? And you've told me that, in the maturations of trying to push for PTC and get the legislation written, you said it was the NTSB that was the only organization that was consistently pushing for it. That other people didn't really want to do it. I mean, talk about that if you don't mind. That's so important.
Yeah, I mean, it's tough because, and it wasn't just on it was on PTC, but I even remember after Marshall, Debbie had testified after Marshall. I mean, a lot of times with these so important safety issues where we've seen tragedies, it's the NTSB that's at the table. I mean, when I worked on the Hill, in 2007, Chairman Obastar took over. And, you know, prior to that, if you're in the minority, you get one witness. And for me, a lot of that times is, well, we're going to have NTSB come up and talk because they're going to make the best safety case ever. But it's fighting alone sometimes. And you did have labor talk about PTC and the need to address safety at that time. But, you know, a lot of people don't realize, but Robert, his first hearing on the Hill was before my subcommittee. So Chairman Obistar took over and he said, one of the first things we're going to do is rail safety. And we're going to have this 2-day hearing on rail safety. And here on the first day was Robert testifying on a 2-day hearing on federal railroad safety improvements. I don't know, you remember?
I've never been so scared in my life.
I understand. That's how I felt at my first board meeting, actually. but it's true. I mean, we are often the only ones, and you know, I think, you know, sometimes we take, unfortunately, criticism from other people of, you know, we're the agency who doesn't have enforcement authority. We don't have rulemaking authority. We don't have teeth. But what makes us strong?
You know, Jennifer, I've heard it said before that the NTSB does not have any teeth. And it's true, we don't have any teeth. But the fact of the matter is we have mighty sharp gums, and we will chew up people with those gums who would get in the way of us trying to get something implemented.
You know, I'm sorry.
Go.
One of the things that that really helped me when I became chairman was to think about what the role of the NTSB was. And I believe that the NTSB is the conscience and the compass of the transportation industry. And I think there are many times where people know what needs to be done, or they know what the right things to do are, but it takes longer than it needs to, or it's only applied to certain levels of vehicles or certain types of equipment. And so, you know, it may be commercial vehicles instead of recreational vehicles when we talk about aviation, or it may be the higher end cars versus the lower end cars. And so when we talk about some of these safety issues, I think a lot of times people know what the right thing to do is. Labor will know what the right thing to do is. The industry, with respect to the technology, will know what the right thing to do is. But, you know, they're balancing competing interests, and their competing interest could be everything from their security and their position, you know, within an organization or an industry, or financial benefit, or it could be productivity, that they would rather double track a line so that they can get more volume through. And they also see safety benefits to having a double track versus a single track, and they think the payoff for that is higher than installing PTC. I think at the end of the day, the PTC issue was hard, and it is one of the most long-standing issues that we've had to face as an agency, because there are so many competing and challenging interests, right? And I think we saw this over decades and decades of fighting over it. But when Jim talks about putting a man on the moon, it was never about the technology. It was about a lot of other things. We have the know-how to do this, and we in fact put it into aviation, into other sectors before it went into railroads. And railroads are a little simpler in some respects when you talk about the way that they operate and the fixed tracks that they're on and their positions. And so I would just say NTSB has to continue to be the conscience and the compass to help people understand what's the North Star, where do we want to go when it comes to safety. And we didn't have to take all the costs into mind. We made recommendations knowing what was best for safety. And so I think that did free us a lot. And the toothless part of that is, if you put all of those requirements that the regulators and others have on NTSB, NTSB couldn't open the aperture as wide as it does. And they couldn't be as free with saying things that are sometimes ahead of their time and sometimes more forward thinking. And so I think that, you know, going back to Chris's opening remarks, it was such a wise thing to create the NTSB the way that it was created. And some of the criticism that come against the NTSB, certainly they're merited, but I think there's also strength in what the NTSB does, and we're emulated the world over. Every other country wants an accident investigation body like the NTSB and tries to figure out how to do it. And so for whatever weaknesses there are also tremendous strengths. And I think the fact that PTC got done and we were the only ones beating the drum for the 30, 40, 50 years, and, you know, I think it's a success, and that's why we're here today.
Absolutely. I think that's well said. And I don't want to move on to the next question unless anyone else wants to add to that.
Well, now that you've given me that invitation, I'm going to jump on it. As the lawyer in the group, I'm going to respond to why Robert is saying that we have such sharp gums. And the reason that even though our recommendations we can't mandate our recommendations, the reason people do it roughly 80% of the time, I don't know what the number is now, but that's the number I used to hear, roughly 80% of the time, is actually very simple, because what they don't want is to be in front of a judge and a jury explaining why they didn't follow a previous NTSB recommendation. And that's a tribute to how good the recommendations are. The recommendations, the reason people pay so much attention to them is because they're very, very good. And actually, I think that's part of that. The reason they're so good is because they're not required, because if they were required, we wouldn't have to make sure that they were so good, because when they're not required, that means if they're not good, people will just throw them away. So when they're that good, people still do it 80%-ish of the time, even though they don't have to. So that's what they don't want, is that they have some explaining to do in court in front of the judge and the jury about why they didn't do what the NTSB recommended. So that's why the gums are so sharp. But let me also mention there's another player in behind the scenes that doesn't often get mentioned that really plays a big role here, and that's part of a lot of the problem is the Office of Management and Budget with their cost, their control filter that is based on the cost benefit analysis. And if it doesn't meet the cost benefit analysis, don't even bother trying, because OMB isn't going to put it through. Now, I'm certainly in agreement that you don't want to just spend money foolishly on all kinds of safety things that all kinds of things that can improve safety, because some can improve safety more efficiently and effectively than others. So your marginal safety improvement dollar, you want to use it as well as possible. But to me, the cost benefit filter, the way it works now, is outdated, and it responds to historic trends and doesn't look to the future. And there are a lot of problems with it that I think it needs to be revisited, because it's a big driver in this equation in terms of what agencies are willing to do, what the industry is willing to do. They are aware of the cost benefit filter. That's a player that is still a problem, because it still has, in my view, outdated tests for the cost benefit to value a human life against improvements. I think just that fundamental concept needs some revisiting in order to be more realistic and in order to help improve safety more effectively than we're doing today.
Absolutely. And right now, I think the DOT has $9.6 million they use per life, which is, you know, in our view, every life is priceless. So with that, you know, I think that's a good segue into talking about the congressional mandate. But before we do that, I do want to talk a little bit about the impact Graniteville and Chatsworth had on the discussion. Debbie, I know you were in Graniteville. Why don't you talk a little bit about that? And, you know, Robert, if you want to chime in, you certainly can chime in on that. But I think also maybe talking about Chatsworth, you were on the board at the time. And maybe Casey, which you had signals were down, so it was a little bit different situation, but that was right in your backyard. Why don't we start with Debbie?
Sure, and I'll start off just by talking about Graniteville. You know, I'd say it was really key to the positive train control timeline because it was such a catastrophic hazmat release. 9 people were killed, hundreds of people were treated for chlorine exposure, and you had a community that was really changed forever. When we were on the ground, it was really challenging. There were 60 tons of chlorine released, and there were also other tank cars that had chemicals in the consist. So it was unclear exactly which cars were breached early on. An area about a mile, a square mile was evacuated, and up to 5 square miles, kind of as they were trying to figure out what was going on. Over 5,000 residents were displaced for weeks. We couldn't get to the crash site for several days because of the leaking tankers that needed to be secured. And the closest that I got while I was on scene was overflying the scene in a helicopter. Just to go in and get the recorders, you had to have hazmat qualified personnel to go into that hot scene. And when we think about with impact to the industry, the industry really saw how great and the impact could be when TIH or PIH were released. And I think there was a huge recognition that it could have been a lot worse than it was in Graniteville. The collision occurred at around 3 a.m. Workers weren't at the nearby plant, kids weren't at school, but the outcomes really were devastating. If you just think about like car dealerships that had a total loss of every car in their lot, and Avondale Mills, which was a local employer, a multi-state operation. It was part of an already ailing textile industry, but it folded following the closure of the Graniteville operations. Just tremendous impact, across the board for this community. And it was not a high population area. And it occurred in a place where there weren't a lot of people present in that cloud. And it could have been a lot riskier if people were moving around and driving and, entering into places that they shouldn't have been. So that's some of my recollections. I think it was a watershed event when it came to PIH, TIH events, and it really was probably the hazmat catalyst on the PTC side, as Chatsworth was the PTC catalyst on the commuter side. And I'll turn it over to Robert.
Yeah, and before if you don't mind me, Robert, just for a second, I mean, on the Graniteville, it was the locomotive engineers' parents who came in to see Chairman Obastar just about a month before, maybe a few weeks before he launched those rail safety hearings that Robert testified at, and continued to advocate for implementing our recommendations and PTC. And they continue to do so today, actually. So it did have a significant impact on what Congress did. Robert.
Yeah, I think the last PTC preventable accident that I personally have been on scene was, of course, the Casey accident, where an Amtrak train was diverted into a siding that was occupied by a standing CSX freight train. Sort of ironically, there's a couple of ironies here. First, well, the distance between Casey and Graniteville, probably only about 60 miles. And South Carolina is not a real big state, so to have two PTC preventable accidents in a small state is sort of unusual. I think the big irony of Casey, as you pointed out, is that the signals were down. They were down to be upgraded for PTC. Yet it was a PTC preventable accident. I mean, there's the real irony there. Had the signals not been down, then the Amtrak crew would have gotten a red aspect. They would have stopped their train, but because the switch was out of position. But unfortunately, that was a potential downside of PTC. Nevertheless, it will save many, many lives over the next several years. Yes, it is unusual too that I literally have a railroad track in my backyard, and that's a CSX line. I could walk. Well, I'd be trespassing, so I won't do it. But I could basically walk along that railroad track, and if I walked far enough, I think about 18 miles, I would reach the accident site. Instead, I drove.
Good. Don't walk on the tracks.
No.
I want to talk a second about, we talk about all the different tragedies, and I think you could all, if you don't mind, talk about what it's like working with the families after a tragedy, especially when we might have to say, hey, there was something that could have prevented this. Jump in.
Jim, I defer to you, sir. You turned your mic off, so go right ahead.
Well, I just say that, my introduction to the families was at the Pittsburgh hearing, 1994, in which I found out just how badly served the families were by the then structure of system for support after a major transportation accident. And after ValueJet, Pittsburgh, and TWA 800, the then president at that time put in place, with our urging, the Family Assistance Act, which is now in service, and our Family Assistance Unit is done yeoman's work since that period of time. We then went up to ISASI, the International the United Nations of Aviation, and was able to get the family assistance idea accepted worldwide, and it's now part of the ISASI recommendations and oversight. So, you talk about these events, and of course, there's someone out there that has personal experience because they lost someone in an event. We're seeing that now with COVID. It didn't really hit home to me until people I knew have passed of that pandemic. So I feel very strongly that the board's responsibility here is obviously to the public, but in doing that, as Debbie so eloquently states, part of the board's responsibility as the conscience is to reach out and provide information and support to the families, which was not done prior to the Family Assistance Act.
I think we all feel the same way. Each of us has had the responsibility to stand in front of family members and feel that frustration and express that frustration that had a particular NTSB recommendation been implemented, we would not be here today and they would not be suffering the loss that they are. And as it relates to positive train control, I had to stand in front of the families of Amtrak 188 and make that very point.
Jennifer, if we still have enough time, I would just say, I think, Jim, what you all did with the Family Assistance Act really set us up for success as an organization, as an agency. The family members, I will say, in my experience, have very often been a tremendous catalyst. Jennifer mentioned family members coming up to the Hill and meeting with members of Congress. Sometimes there's the facts and the figures and the data, and then sometimes you need the personal story, and you need, people to engage and to feel it with their heart and not just their mind, that something needs to change and something needs to be done. I would say many family members don't know about the NTSB before the event occurs. Then they get to meet us and they get to know us. And I would say over time, many of those family members have been some of the most powerful advocates and allies for this agency because of the process that was created and because of the engagement and because we are the truth tellers. And I'd say they need that. The families need that even in the greatest grief that they're experiencing in their life. They need someone who's going to be straight with them about what's going on. I would just say there's great strength in the family members, and there's incredible grace. And so even though they're upset and they're angry when you're on scene sometimes about what's happened, I found that they are very very willing to look past that to help and try to figure out what's next. I've found some of my longest relationships post NTSB have been with family members. And so, you know, I would just say, I think that they're one of the greatest partners that we have. Now, if you make mistakes with the family members, that can really cause a lot of problems. And so I think we all recognize the risks there. And so that's why having a process and following that process is so important.
I think what you said is spot on. And I never got the chance to share this with you, Jim, but after I did a speech before Pipeline Safety Trust, a few months after I came on the board, Liam Wood's father came up to me afterwards and said exactly what you said. He said he never, and this was a long time, and he will never forget what the NTSB did for his family and for the families on scene. It's something he will always remember.
So I'd like to chime in on that because Jim, you obviously know this, but others who are listening may not. You started the family assistance with commercial aviation accidents, but it was so successful that the NTSB applied it to everything they now apply it to everything they do, whether it's required by statute or not. And some places it is required by statute, but most instances it isn't. And I have to say that the most challenging aspects of what I ever did as chairman was meeting the families at the board meeting where the accident was being deliberated, and it's so tastefully, the NTSB so tastefully sets those families aside so they don't have to mingle with the general audience, and to meet separately in that set aside room with the families to talk about what our role is and what we can do and how important their role is in helping move the needle. That was a wonderful aspect of the experience of being chairman.
Yeah, I think we will always remember the families that we meet with, and they always remain in our hearts, I think. We have a few minutes, and I do want to give kudos to, you know, we have transportation disaster assistance and others within the agency, and we're gonna transition in a minute to talk to the staff. It's not all the staff. I wish I could have everybody on here. But I do want to talk about one key thing that the staff does. We often talk about investigations, you know, and we don't need to go through the history of the most wanted list in PTC. What I do want to talk about and hear from you is what you think the importance of safety advocacy and the most wanted list is for the agency and for safety.
Well, it's the part of the gums that Robert talks about. You know, you got to keep these safety issues alive, and at the congressional level, at the public level, and with those people who've suffered with the families. And so I can't say enough about public service and the public servants we have at the NTSB. And I am so grateful that the leadership that we've had at the board has been so outstanding, and I think that's reflected with my three chairmen that I have the pleasure of appearing with today.
I would say, for us as board members, to some extent, we're guests. We're visitors at the agency for a period of time. And thank you for letting us come back and talk about an agency that we loved, and I think we're also honored to serve at. But I would say, when I talk to people about the work that we did and how people would sometimes think how hard it was, in the calls that you get in the middle of the night, I never thought it was hard. I always loved it because what we did was important. And I think we have an incredible staff. And when you ask people about how hard things are, I think about the staff who've investigated all of these accidents and have to go back to the scene time and time and time again. And they know what happened, and it's happened before, and they've made recommendations, and they've sometimes fallen on deaf ears. And I think that's the hardest thing, right? Is when you have to keep doing the same thing over and over again, and things don't change. And so I'm so excited that we're going to hear from the staff, but I would say they are the heartbeat that keeps the issues alive from one chairman to the next. And they are the ones that will continue to see things through. Most of us during our tenures, we don't even get to see recommendations closed out because they often take a long time. And it's up to all of those teams, advocacy and investigations, and everyone to keep it going. And so I'm excited for what the next few decades hold and the changes that the NTSB will make. Robert and Jennifer, under your leadership and with the support of a great team.
I have to chime in on that because the staff obviously is who makes it work. And it's amazing to me how, as Debbie says, despite years and years of going on without things necessarily happening. I mean, the reason the things are on the most wanted list is precisely because they are so difficult to obtain. But that encourages us to push rather than discourages us. And the staff, I've never seen the staff discouraged by, I mean, even some things that came off the list, like motorcycle helmets. So we've been pushing for motorcycle helmets forever, and there's never been a question about safety on motorcycle helmets. The question was about who is Big Brother to tell me what to put on my head. But yet staff, seeing how difficult that was to accomplish, never was discouraged and went in like troopers and went after it. And sooner or later, these things happen, but it takes a lot of persistence. And I can't tell you how much I admire the staff for their persistence. And plus, what's not to like about them doing all the work and us getting all the credit.
I agree. And Jennifer, I know we're out of time, but
all right, you started, you get to finish.
Well, thanks. I'll put a period on this particular thought here. When you look at the Federal Employee Viewpoint Survey, over 99% of the respondents, and we do have a high response rate, about 80% of the employees respond to it, and over 99% say that they're willing to put in the extra effort to get the job done. And when we compare that to other federal agencies, and we can, the figures actually compare it to other agencies, we stand head and shoulders above because of our workforce. We do have a very dedicated, very devoted staff, and I'm so glad that you will be featuring some of those in the next hour. And thank you, Jennifer, for your leadership in your entire life, actually. So
thank you.
Anyway.
Thank you all. This has been fantastic. I really appreciate you joining us today and allowing me to ask you questions that I didn't send you in advance. So thank you very much. And this is a perfect segue to a really great video that James Anderson put together. All right, well, all the staff, feel free to turn on your cameras. I'm very excited about this second half of our celebration of NTSB's 50 years of advocacy for PTC. So, the public doesn't get to hear, outside of a board meeting, a lot from the key people behind the scenes, and there's so many at the NTSB. I really wish we could have had everybody here, but we can't. So thank you all for joining this portion, and I hope people watching don't leave, because there's some, I did pre-interview people, and there's some really great things I know they want to share. So let's get into it. Why don't we start with introductions? When you introduce yourself, maybe talk about how long you've been at the board. I'll recognize each of you by first name, and then talk about what you do at the board, what your division does, what your office does. We'll start, I'll go along with how it shows on the screen. So we'll start with Eric Weiss. Eric's on mute.
Sorry, I'm a public affairs officer in safety recommendations and communications office. Been here for 8 years, and I've been on scene for 7 PTC preventable accidents.
Great. Stephanie.
Hi, my name is Stephanie.
Oh, the other Stephanie.
Yeah. We were waiting.
Stephanie Matonic, we will start with you.
It's an honor. My name is Stephanie Matonic. I work for the NTSB's Transportation Disaster Assistance Division, which many people know as the Family Assistance Division. And my responsibility as a specialist is to kind of provide those updates and the information, be that point of contact to families and those survivors who are involved in the accidents we investigate. Thank you.
Thank you. And now we'll go to Stephanie Shaw.
Sure. I'm Stephanie Shaw. I joined the NTSB in 1997, and I work in our Safety Advocacy Division. And I am honored to be part of the team that really gets to help keep the conversation going and making sure that the focus stays on the safety recommendations that we've made.
Great. Ruben.
Yes, good afternoon. I'm an electrical engineer with the Office of Rail Safety, one of the rail investigators, and I'm coming up on 25 years with the safety board.
Wow. And Chris Wallace.
Afternoon. I'm the chief of NTSB's Government and Industry Affairs division. I've been at NTSB since 2016. My office, our main focus is on communicating about NTSB investigations and other activities with officials at all levels of government. So federal, obviously the Hill and other federal agencies, but also state and local governments.
Great. Tim.
My name is Tim DePape. I came to the safety board in 2008. I'm a rail accident investigator specializing in signal systems. My first major accident was Chatsworth, California, where I was the signal group chairman.
Right. Jeff.
My name is Jeff Marcus. I'm the chief of the NTSB Safety Recommendations Division. In about 2 weeks, I'll mark 22 years with the NTSB.
Thank you. James.
Hello, my name is James Anderson. I work in the communications office, SRC. I serve as the agency's videographer, and I've been with the agency since 2016.
Thank you. And that was a great video. Thank you for that. Rob.
Yeah, I'm Robert Hall. I'm the director of the Office of Railroad Pipeline and Hazardous Materials Investigation. I've been with the board for 10 years now. Started shortly after the RICE of 2008.
Great. Mike.
Hello, my name's Michael Hiller. I'm joined the NTSB in 2011 as an investigator. I've been IIC on several accidents, and recently I took the position of deputy director in the Office of Railroad Pipeline and Hazardous Materials.
Congratulations.
Thank you.
All right, we're going to get into the questions. If anyone wants to chime in on anything, feel free. You can wave, you can raise your hand, however you want to do it, but feel free. We want it to be an open discussion. So let me start with Ruben and Tim. Both of you are recognized experts on PTC and signal systems. And so how influential was the board's role in PTC?
In my previous job at the Brotherhood of Railroad Signalmen, I started working on PTC in 1994. And I met Ruben Payan at some of the RSAC committees, the Rail Safety Advisory Committees on PTC. And him and Pat Sullivan worked on it. And that was my first real exposure to the NTSB and their mission. And it was very influential in how I shaped how I looked at things, and ultimately the way he acted and his dedication actually turned me on to possibly going to the NTSB. And he was instrumental in helping develop PTC and the regulations, and he was a great example to that.
Ruben?
Yeah, no, I agree. As we saw in the video, NTSB has been pushing for PTC since 1970. So the concept was there. The technology needed to catch up, but PTC kept waving the flag on it. And through our recommendations, it kept pushing the railroads to try different things, develop test beds, it pushed FRA into developing regulations that would eventually become mandated in 2008. So NTSB was very influential because of its recommendations in always keeping PTC on the forefront.
Now, and I wanted to follow up with Tim on one thing. A lot of people may not realize I knew Tim before he came to the NTSB. He worked for the Railroad Signalmen. And Tim, you know, in that respect, you were there for your brothers and sisters in rail labor. You saw, I think you were at Graniteville or came at some point afterwards to work with the crews. And you know, what's it like? I mean, how do you explain, you know, to crew members and, you know, others, whether it's workers or the public, that you have something that could have prevented an accident, and you know, it just repeats itself?
It's very difficult to talk to family members and surviving friends and coworkers about fatalities that you see over and over again. And as difficult as that is, it needs to be done. And one thing in my former job, I'd have to go to funerals occasionally, and I couldn't wait for the day when PTC was implemented and these types of accidents could be prevented, and I wouldn't have to go to any more funerals. But it's through the combined efforts of rail labor, the NTSB, and at times even the regulator, that we can get to the end that we need to get, like with the implementation of positive train control, get it implemented, which we finally have. And I've said this before and I'll say it again, I'd like nothing better than it to put me out of business.
That's true. You mentioned, you know, it's difficult after, you know, after accidents, seeing families and meeting with crew members. And I think, you know, I think it's difficult for the public to understand how just tragic the scenes are of these accidents. And you know, I will come back to the rail investigators in a second on that, but I want to talk to James for a second, because James, you know, you have an important role that a lot of people don't realize, because you're behind the scenes. You're documenting what happened, you know, you're documenting what everyone's doing on the scene, and honestly, what you do helps with transparency to the public, So it shows them what happened. And so, I mean, you've been on a number of tragedies, a couple PTC related and others not. I mean, what's that? What are your thoughts on that?
So I've been, like you said, I've been on about 7 rail accidents among the many accidents I've been on. And for me, when you get on scene, the obvious elephant in the room is the accident scene. And I try not to be overwhelmed with the tragedy at hand. And I try to focus on what my actual mission is to help translate visually the facts that you and the other board members share. I try to assist you all with that. So one of the quotes I like to share is, if you can't imagine the facts or the information that's being shared with you, then the information is useless. So I try to enhance or share or enhance the information that you're sharing with the visuals that I share.
Yeah, I mean, the media uses your visuals, and that's what the public sees afterwards, which is so helpful in communicating what we're doing and like I said, maintaining transparency. It must be difficult to see different scenes. So I appreciate what you mentioned. Eric Weiss, I know you've been on a number of tragedies, and James, feel free to chime in again, but Eric, you've been on, I think, 7. I might be PTC related, but what do you think when you're there? I mean, you're doing the media.
Well, I remember my first accident, which was Goodwell, Oklahoma, and most people watching this, and most people, have never been to a train accident. I've never been to a train accident until this time. I was completely blown away by the scale, by the enormity of the forces that came into contact. It was still on fire. There were puddles of aluminum that have melted and were literally formed puddles under your feet. That there were, there were bodies that were being taken care of. It is an incredible scene. And as James said, I was just standing there taking in the scene, but all the investigators at that point have been running around doing exactly what they needed to do, because they've been to many, many scenes like this, and immediately were dispatched, one over to signals, over to the command module. Everyone knew exactly what to do. And after a few minutes, I went ahead and did my job. But the scene itself, it's hard to describe. The only thing I could think of was it was an airstrike, a military airstrike. The powers that were involved were unbelievable.
Yeah, I'll touch upon that, Member Homendy, if I can.
Yeah.
My very first launch was to Panhandle, Texas. And much like Eric said, the scene is striking. It is the first thing you see. But as he said, you have a job to do, and I try to focus on that job, transmitting that imagery. The imagery doesn't really sell, I wouldn't say sell, but it doesn't really translate the enormity, as Eric said, of the actual scene. I compare it to a photo of the mountains versus actually being next to the mountain. You don't really get the scope of the mountains unless you're actually there. And so that's one thing that I hope people understand, that when these trains actually derail or crash, it's a large actual crash, and it's very devastating to the people in that area and to the land in that area.
Yeah, and I want to ask the investigators real quick, and then and there's 4: Ruben, Tim, Rob, and Mike. So feel free to chime in different ways. You don't all have to, or you can. And then I'll probably go to Chris and Stephanie. But what is that like? You have a job to do when you get there and you get right in it. But obviously these are personal tragedies that you don't leave on scene. That's something you feel. Tim, you want to start?
Sure. I think it hits all of us differently, but if you've ever experienced a tragedy or lost a family member in an accident yourself, it brings some of those feelings back. But what pushes me through the situation is that even though it's reactive, what we do, the accident happens, we examine it, we determine a probable cause, we make recommendations. I get a good feeling thinking that what I'm recommending may prevent this type of accident happening again, and can prevent future families and future people from going through the ripple effect of the loss of life of either a worker or a passenger on a train. That's how I deal with it.
Others, Ruben, Rob, or Mike, do you want to chime in at all?
Thanks, Member Homendy. Yeah, the emotional part of it for me comes when I get to interact with the victims involved in the particular accident, and our presence comes with a brand of trust and a brand of hope. And if they don't know us already, we're able to let them know that through this investigation, we offer the potential to prevent reoccurrence. And in a lot of cases, that gives closure the right way to families and victims that have suffered the accident.
All right, anyone else?
Yeah, I like to agree with everybody. I don't. It doesn't matter. I don't think it matters how many times you've been to some of these big accidents. Every time you show up on scene, just the enormity of the destruction is always takes your breath away, and you focus on your job and try not to let all the destruction, all the personal items around that are laying around affect you. You try not to, just to protect yourself. You focus on your job and you try and get the job done, knowing that you might be able to help remedy the situation. If you find out what happened, maybe this won't happen again. And that kind of drives you to ignore some of the destruction and not let it affect you so much.
I think those are all great points.
And if I may, Member Homendy, real quickly, the most frustrating thing for me is I was at Goodwill. If PTC was there, that accident is prevented. I was at Chatsworth, horrific accident. PTC's working, that accident's prevented. I've been on at least a half dozen accidents where if PTC was implemented and deployed and operational, those accidents don't happen. That's been the most frustrating thing for me over the last 13 years, knowing that almost every one of these accidents I've been to are preventable. That gets me more than the devastation. It's just the frustration of knowing this shouldn't be happening.
Absolutely. I think, the same applies to talking to family members. And I'd like to recognize Stephanie for a second. I know that your office, you've spoken with many family members, including, I know you mentioned something on Philly 188. If you want to talk about that for a second.
Thank you, Member Homendy, and it's an honor to be here. And just what Tim had said, the devastation is tough, but when it comes to that preventable possibility, that really is the hardest. And full disclosure, I had the opportunity to work for former Chairman Hersman and Chairman Somalt prior to my joining the Disaster Assistance Division. So I learned about PTC, through their lens and through their fight and their commitment to that. And when I joined the Disaster Assistance Division, I didn't quite realize what that meant for me and my career and my position. And Philadelphia was the one that really brought it home, that one in DuPont. And I remember launching with our team to Philly and hearing from our investigative staff and our chairman about that this was a PTC preventable accident. And I didn't quite know what that meant in my world until we were facing those families and those survivors who had just experienced probably the worst day of their life. And, how do you explain to them that this could have been prevented had the system been in place. That was trying. And I will say, you know, having a couple months down the road, having to update them that, you know, this deadline had been pushed, you know, that was hard. And then of course, you know, traveling to DuPont and kind of seeing those same statements come out that this was PTC preventable, and realizing that we're going to be facing that again with these families and survivors. But I know this is, you know, I don't want to end my part on such a low experience, because I know there was some really good things that came from this. And I know this is kind of celebrating the work to get that PTC implemented. And I'm so honored to be here. So I did want to say, at least for me personally, for that implementation, I am little relieved that I don't have to repeat that to families and to survivors, that this is not something that I have to prepare myself, and my team doesn't have to prepare themselves and my team members to say that again and to explain that to them. And another thing that really came out of Philadelphia and DuPont that just I hold on to, because it is a tough job, is that when Philadelphia happened and then DuPont a few years later, those families from Philly and the survivors reaching out to us just to be connected to the families and survivors of DuPont, simply to provide support, to be there because they had that shared experience. Those are the things that kind of we hold on to, and also just to have the opportunity to be witness to all the staff on NTSB, the investigators, our board members, our advocacy groups, safety recs, all of you, to watch the fight for this implementation and to finally get to it. I just want to say it's an honor, and I'm so grateful to be witness to it. So thank you, thank you for all the work you all did. And, thank you for supporting me and our TDA team and supporting the families and survivors through those tough accidents. Thank you.
And Stephanie, if I could keep you for a second,
Sure.
Some watching may wonder, do we also provide assistance to the staff? Because it can be very difficult. I know recently you did a tremendous webinar for staff that I listened to on our employee assistance program and opportunities to reach out. Maybe you could talk a little bit about that for a second on what we do provide, because some people might wonder that.
Sure, no, thank you. Thank you for that question and for highlighting what we've seen as being really important to our own folks and to our own people. As a federal agency, we do have an employee assistance program, and I was really lucky to just be a part of some of the staff that kind of realized that this could be more and provide more support to our investigators, to our support staff, anybody who is involved with all the investigations and facing that devastation and destruction. And we are a tough crew. We are experienced as I can't even list the amount of years just on looking at the screen here. But it does get to us in some ways. And so, at the minimum, at least for the NTSB and our, employee assistance, just making sure that our folks know that they can reach out and that they're being cared for and that they're not alone in this and that we are peers together. I think that was really the focus and the drive to push support to our employees, through those assistance programs. And I'm hoping that it continues to be beneficial to everyone, new and old, who've been on board with the agency for a while.
Great. I now want to turn to Chris Wallace for a second. Chris, you have an important job on scene where, well, you know what? I'm going to let you talk about what happens on scene for your job. Go ahead.
Yeah, sure. So usually with a major accident, especially if there's a board member launch, someone, either I or someone else from our team will go on scene. As you can imagine, when an accident happens, officials, members of Congress, governors, state legislators, obviously the mayors, all those elected officials are very interested in the details of what happened and how it will impact their constituents. And even back here in Washington or in the state capitals, they're very interested in, the larger issues of transportation safety policy. So when we're there on scene, I mean, what we try to do is, mainly we try to, keep them out of the way of the investigators, so that they can do their important job. I mean, the most important job that they have, but also make sure that we're upholding our transparency and clear communication on what the safety issues, that we're seeing are, try to knock down, maybe some speculation, just because the facts haven't taken us there yet. So, and trying to coordinate briefings and scene visits if there's some interest, kind of getting, back to, talking about how people are impacted. I mean, obviously when something happens, we're always talking to people back in Washington about the larger policy issues. But I mean, in my 5 years, I've launched on a handful of accidents, and I mean, there's been several that I've gone on, both rail accidents, including a PTC accident, and other ones, some of the highway accidents where the members or the governor or the state legislator have personally known people who were fatalities in that investigation. So it's very personal for those people. What's happening in their communities, involving people, that are their constituents and, people that they know in the community. And usually those are the people who usually are the champions, back in the state capitals and back here in Congress to affect those changes whenever our reports are done, for that. So we see that as part of that bridge of, making sure we communicate, here are the safety issues, here's what our recommendations are to make sure that something like this doesn't happen again. And, if the agencies don't carry through, then sometimes there's, other ways to make it happen.
And afterwards, you're usually working with them on some piece of legislation, right?
Right, correct, yeah.
Yeah. And, Debbie alluded to it or talked about it earlier, and you just talked about it now, that sometimes when, whether it's members of Congress or local officials go to an accident scene, it becomes very personal to them. And so, Mike, you, I believe it was 188, had someone come to, was it 188? Yeah, someone come to that tragedy, and you spoke to him. So why don't you talk about that?
Yeah, so it is a unique opportunity when you get to engage with Congress, because they're interested in improving transportation safety. So Amtrak 188, high-speed derailment, 6 passenger coaches, and one of them was a cafe coach. And Senator Tom Harper from Delaware happened to be on the cafe coach one station prior to going around the curve and the train derailing. So I'm out on scene and I'm doing the validation of the brake systems to make sure that those were in operating order. And I get a call. He wants to come out and have a look. Now, prior to that, I had no knowledge of his, whereabouts during that accident. So he shows up on shows up on scene, and I start introducing myself and explaining, what we're doing. And he tells me he wants to walk to the cafe car. So I walk him out there, and, there's this period of just sort of silent reflection I can pick up from his perspective. And I'm not probing or asking questions. I'm just making sure that he can safely get from point A to point B, because it's really not a safe place for people to walk around in. We climb into the car, and the car is now upright. The tables and the chairs and everything are all askew and damaged. And slowly we make our way back to a particular table, and he just stops and stares. And he turns back and he said, "This is where I was sitting just before I got off, and had I stayed on the train, I don't know if I would have made it." And that struck me. I won't forget it. It's memorable, it's meaningful. And his visit there wasn't just so that he could personally reflect. I think, like what Chris is saying, he carries that experience back with him when he does his legislation to help improve transportation safety. And he thanked me for that. And that was a meaningful moment in my career, and I'll never forget it.
Thanks for sharing that. I want to talk a little bit about how tough it was to get to PTC. And let me start with Jeff Marcus for a second. Why don't you talk about what you do after we approve a report, and how you keep it going with these recommendations?
I end up having a somewhat different perspective from many of the people. I almost never go out to accident scenes. I don't interact with the families. What I do is, after the investigation is completed and we make the recommendations, and you heard all the previous chairmen talking about the recommendations and what led to PTC being the recommendations out there pushing. I'm the guy who, or people who work for me are the people who push on the organizations like the FRA and the individual railroads to take the actions that we've recommended. We are the kind of the pain in the rear end to these various organizations to not forget about PTC when it's not in the media spotlight at the moment. These recommendations have been out there for 50 years. The fact that they have been out there has given us the vehicle to keep advocating for these, for pushing for it to be an NTSB position, for us to be able to go anywhere and everywhere and say, this is something that needs to be done. And without that, and I think the previous chairman spoke much better than I ever could, without those recommendations being there, it probably would have been forgotten, or it would have been forgotten between accidents and would come up for mention when there was a new accident and then forgotten afterwards. That was the situation I think we have seen in other modes of transportation. It was the case with airbags. It was the case with collision avoidance systems and ground proximity warning and fuel tank inerting in aviation. And any mode of transportation, when you come up with a new technology that proves to be effective, you need to push on it very hard, because it's going to be expensive. It's going to take a lot of technology to get it done, but our recommendations are what allow us to do that.
Yeah, so you would compare, and you've worked on a lot in your career. You were previously with NHTSA, but you would compare PTC to what big developments over time? You mentioned a few just now, but
to me, PTC is a major technological innovation that addresses instances where human beings may fail for a moment, and in that moment, a chain of events gets started that will create a tragedy. PTC will interrupt that chain and prevent it from happening. I think in aviation, things like collision avoidance systems and ground proximity warning systems are systems that allow a pilot who, for whatever reason, may have momentarily made a mistake, so the airplane is going to hit the ground or the airplane is going to run into another airplane. And PTC is like those systems. It detects an imminent hazard. It takes steps to prevent it from happening and stops the accident from occurring.
And you mentioned keeping recommendations open and having those safety recommendations. I believe the accident and are determining the probable cause is crucial, but just as crucial afterwards is the work we do to implement the recommendations, because that's in the end what improves safety. So let me talk to Stephanie Shaw a little bit, and James or Eric, please chime in, or Chris too, because we have to keep these issues alive. I mean, Eric, you have to keep these issues alive in the press, James, you're constantly working on imagery, videos, production of things to keep them out in the public. Chris, you're often working with members of Congress who wish to implement something or not implement something. So that's a big challenge. And Stephanie Shaw, your role at Safety Advocacy, talk about that a little bit. Let's start with Stephanie, and everybody feel free if anyone wants to chime in on that.
Sure. So I think, we've said, especially, hearing from the chairman and Member Homendy, you in the first panel, the investigators on scene and the accidents themselves and even the board meetings do draw a lot of attention. And we certainly have an opportunity to call attention to, like you just said, in the probable cause, when we say something like a fully implemented PTC system would have prevented this crash, not could have, but would have prevented this crash, and how powerful that is. But then the work of, almost everyone here, when it comes to advocacy, the board members, the investigators, Chris Wallace's team in government affairs, safety recs, we all work together to do the advocacy work. And that really does start when the recommendations are issued and those final reports are adopted, working together to make sure that it doesn't get forgotten. I think if you're directly impacted by an event, certainly you keep that conversation going, but how can we as an agency not just make the recommendations, but really advocate to see full implementation of them?
Let me ask I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
I want to ask a follow-up to that, because some people may wonder, well, how do you do that? What do you do, with these recommendations afterwards? Jeff is working with the agencies and the recommendation recipients, but how do you get these out in the public all the time? What do you do after?
Sure. So I think most notably is, our most wanted list. I think when we elevate an issue to the most wanted list, and unfortunately PTC has been on there, like you said, 1990 and almost every year for the last 30 years, that is our most powerful tool to really call attention to a safety improvement that needs to be made. But also having board members who champion, the cause. You have, since coming on board, have been the board member lead on the issue, and you and investigators and staff continuing to meet with industry, doing the congressional hearings, holding public events, having a discussion like this, really just keeps the spotlight on the safety improvement. Not giving up until we're able to come to an event like this where we can actually celebrate the hard work that's gone into, and the fact that, like you pointed out too, sometimes we were the only voice, advocating for PTC implementation, that we didn't give up, that there was always someone, willing to kind of pick up the baton and keep the race going. Even we had board members changing and staff changing and office instructors and investigators retiring. There's always been someone to come in behind and make sure that this issue wasn't forgotten. And we do that for, not just what's on the most wanted list, but all the recommendations that the agency makes.
It's interesting, just to jump on what Stephanie said, is that a lot of these accidents, these are very rare. News organizations do not have a PTC crash reporter. So these journalists are coming to each crash and they're treating them individually as a separate and finite activity. But with something with the most wanted list, when you could point reporters to, well, this has happened 153 other times, it puts it in perspective, and it shows the context in which this particular crash, it's not just a finite event. It's one of a string of many, many more since 1969. So the most wanted list has really helped put in perspective the problem that these are not just one-offs, but this is a series of preventable accidents that keep on happening over and over and over again. And that's what we try to, the message we try to impart to reporters covering that particular accident.
Yeah, so it goes back to the question you presented earlier, Member Homendy, to the former chairman and the current chairman. How do we keep the public interested in an event that already happened? We try to strike a balance between using the imagery without sensationalizing someone's tragedy. And like Stephanie and Eric mentioned, we have the most wanted list, we have our forums, we have our roundtables, we have our webinars, our live discussions. that we keep pushing the issue so that it's taken seriously and it's acted on in a timely manner.
Chris, I don't know if you wanted to chime in on the legislative side. It can be tough when you have something that, you know, it gets done and then all of a sudden the deadline's extended, and that's tough. And, you know, but your role, you know, in keeping those issues to the forefront in Congress is critical. Do you want to talk about?
Sure. You're absolutely right. It's tricky. You know, I mean, I think the benefit of being at NTSB is, you know, we have a mandate to almost singularly focus on safety. So recommendations are based on what improves safety. Now, when you get to the regulatory process and the legislative process, you know, policymakers have so many other things that they need to consider, and, you know, and goes into that. And that's why, you know, sometimes, you know, things can take 50 years because it's subject to the policymaking process. And, you know, so our role in it really is to, you know, continue to kind of beat the drum of, you know, this is what we found, this is what we've seen, this is the recommendations we've made, you know, to improve safety. Sometimes our recommendations can be prescriptive as far as this regulatory action is needed, and sometimes it's, you know, pretty broad to get to kind of an end goal of it. You know, so our role is really to try to, where in the course of policy making, where issues of, you know, feasibility and cost, and, you know, what are the benefits and what are the downsides, you know, just try to continue to talk about what our experience is and try to, you know, continue to keep our reputation intact as professionals and nonpartisan as far as it goes on, you know, these are safety issues and this is what, you know, the board, you know, itself has seen is what we need to focus on to improve safety.
Well, and I think some of the benefits for you and also Joseph, who works with you on your team, is that you worked on the Hill, and that gives you a unique perspective on how to get things done. And then Steve, he does a tremendous amount. I don't know if you could chat a little bit about what Steve does on the state side. And I know that doesn't factor into PTC, but it's an important component to the NTSB. So I just want to provide that.
Yeah, sure. So Steve Blackstone has been at NTSB for a long time and worked on state and local issues, advocacy issues for a long time. So, I mean, it fits right in. I mean, when an accident happens, like I said, it's happening in states and cities where those officials are interested in what's going on and are personally impacted on it. So even though it's a federal issue, I mean, they play a role in seeing some of those changes made. You know, so yeah, besides working on the Hill issues, I mean, we work a lot along with Stephanie and others in safety advocacy on in state capitals on highway issues a lot. I mean, that's where a lot of that legislation focuses on. And we also try to support investigations where, you know, there may be, especially state, you know, laws and regulations where they play in and do some of that background, you know, work on that.
Well, and staying with that for a second, you know, there was a point where, and I'm going to turn to the investigators for a second. There was a point where PTC looked like it would be, you know, at one point it was a full 5-year extension automatically. Then it became 18 with an additional 2 years for the DOT to do. Was there a point, and, you know, in all that time, you were still investigating PTC preventable tragedies. And so, you know, was there a point where you maybe thought PTC would never happen?
I'll start. I think there were several times, even before the mandate came up. When I started with NTSB, I was told to take good notes, collect everything, and be prepared to pass it on to the person behind me when I retire. So I wasn't expecting it to see it in my lifetime. We kept investigating accidents, and the technology was catching up. So we knew eventually the railroads would see that this was a beneficial, besides just the safety part, which we were advocating for. But there was a period of time when the railroads and the FRA took a stance that this was going to be too expensive, and they started campaigning against not doing it. And then so we were brought in and questioned, why should this stay on the most wanted? Why should we still make recommendations? And so we started coming up with other reasons of why this is still an important issue. And luckily it stayed on, and NTSB kept advocating for it. So
Others want to chime in, don't feel pressured, but Tim, I see you just turned off your mic.
Yeah, safety changes in the rail industry are like watching glaciers move. I mean, the grade crossing regulations took about 25 years from basically when they started on it to when they stopped it. It takes major events to even get the ball rolling. That goes back to when there were steam engines. When the steam engines were blowing up, it wasn't until they killed enough people that the government usually has had to step in on almost all major rail safety implementations to get the ball rolling. The same with air brakes for trains. It was because of accidents that happened, government had enough, they stepped in. The same thing with PTC. We've seen it at the NTSB. We documented, we pushed it for 40 years or 32 years at the time of Chatsworth. But when you kill 25 people on national TV and you realize that the trains hit just outside of a tunnel, if that accident would have happened in that tunnel, everyone on that passenger train would have died because they would have never been able to get them out. And instead of 25, it might have been 400 dead, and they'd probably still be taking the mountain apart to get at it. So it's that type of accident that gets people to go, because the government, you were there in Congress, they basically said, we've had enough hearing about interoperability and how you can't get together. We're going to regulate it. We're going to make it a law, get together, pick a platform so you could be interoperable. And that's what happened. They finally forced them to go to the table and get it done.
Yeah, and you had told us, I think during our podcast a few weeks ago, something your father said to you.
Yeah, I did. My dad was involved in the grade crossing regulations. He was a signalman, and he also worked for the union as a local chairman. And when I started on PTC, it was 1994. And my dad jokingly said to me, he's like, well, that won't be implemented until you're retired. I could have retired at 60, which is a couple of years ago, and he would have been right. But I'm retiring this year, and it's just getting implemented. I never thought it would take this long. I really didn't. But your question about what was some of the hang-up, I think the industry was hoping that if there was an administration change, that it would go away because they wanted to do it at their rate of speed where they wanted to do it. And it didn't go away, and they had to follow through.
There are actually, and I think we might have lost Rob here, but there are people watching who are probably saying, well, PTC is not going to prevent every tragedy. PTC doesn't work everywhere. Maybe it might be good to recognize some of those things. So do you, Mike, Ruben, or Tim, you can all talk about that for as much time as you need.
Well, I'll take a stab at it. As currently envisioned, it's only going to prevent collisions up to restricted speed. Anything below that, it won't prevent those. It's not going to prevent rear-end collisions for the time being. But I think as the systems get deployed and they gain more confidence, they'll be able to lower the speed limit for preventable collisions. But it will not end them all, but it will definitely mitigate the accidents, if not outright prevent them. And the accidents we talked about today, like Philadelphia, Chatsworth, Red Oak, Iowa, well, not Red Oak, Iowa, Chatsworth, Philadelphia, a whole bunch of them, it will prevent those accidents. And again, those are, the most fatalities, both workers and passengers. and the most damage. So we get the low-hanging fruit, so to speak. We'll get the big accidents first, and as they get deployed, they'll be able to get the lesser impact accidents. And I think it'll be a real improvement.
And maybe Ruben, you can chime in there. What do you mean by restricted speed? Because you were just in Cary, Ohio.
Yes, there's certain speed on the railroad. Restricted speed means either 20 or 50 miles miles per hour or slower, being able to stop your train within half the range of vision. So again, it takes the signal system out, and now it relies on the operator, the single point failure again, to operate his train at a speed that can stop before another train or another switch in front of him. So when you're operating at restricted speed, you're basically taking the signal system out and relying on the operator alone, or the crew alone. So, and just to add to what Tim said, the big right now, the big accidents are grade crossing accidents. PTC won't prevent those right now, but I think this is a good stepping stone. In the future, this will be maybe as the systems become more intelligent, there will be some grade crossing protection that can be built in. We're talking about several years down the road as technology advances, but we got to start somewhere. And I think PTC is a good stepping stone for future technology to be implemented.
And in fact, and Chris probably remembers this, but I testified a little while ago on Amtrak and talked about PTC, and Senator Roger Wicker is a big champion on grade crossings. And he asked about PTC and grade crossings, and there's a provision in an act for DOT to look at that now. Now that it's implemented, they need to look, they're required to implement that in a study. Along those lines, on improvements, let's talk about what are some potentials for PTC 2.0. I know, Tim, you talked about that, and Ruben, Mike, you're welcome to chime in, but Tim, you talked about that on our podcast.
Yeah, it's like I alluded to in my last answer. I mean, as they refine things, they'll be able to prevent more and more types of accidents. But one thing I just wanted to say real quickly is there's a cliche on railroads that they tell new hires: red signals don't stop trains, engineers do. Because don't put yourself in peril just because the signal's red thinking the train's going to stop. With positive train control, it's predictive. It is red signals will alert the system to stop the train prior to getting there. The way it is now, as I said, it's reactive. It's not until an engineer runs a red signal. But as far as your question, and I alluded to, I think they'll get the speed of preventing collisions down to what I referred to as coupling speed, which is in the 4 to 7 mile range. Once you get down to that speed, you're really going to mitigate the accidents that are going to happen. I mean, right now, 20 to 20 collision will still it has its potential for a lot of damage. A 4 to 5 mile an hour collision, you're probably not going to crack tanker cars. You're probably not going to, have major, evacuations, fires, things like that. So I look forward to that. And as Ruben talked about, there's discussion of putting inductors at grade crossings to alert the train that there's a stopped car at a grade crossing. If it gets stuck there and there's enough time to warn it, you can warn the train to where it can stop. But even if he can't stop, every mile per hour he slows down, you mitigate the accident. And there was one more item, and it's slipping off the top of my head.
How about maintenance crews?
Maintenance crews, yeah. It'll also, what they're going to do now is prevent incursions into roadway work zones. And that's where they set up authority to do their work. But I can envision a time, I used to say 20 years ago that when GPS got small enough to about the size of a grain of rice, they would implant it on the workers and then put it as part of the rail system. But I think what they'll do now is kind of like an Apple Watch, where they'll be able to monitor where the workers are and alert the trains if the workers are in conflict with the track. I see that type of development as as we go down the road, a couple of years down the road. I don't think it'll be 25 years, but I think it might be 5 years or so. But they'll be able to do things to make things safer, increase productivity, and really protect their assets. And workers are their assets. They train workers. They spend a lot of money training engineers and signal personnel. And to keep them, quite frankly, alive and not getting injured is a good thing for the railroad. So there's motivation for them to do it for that, and there's motivation for them to do it for safety.
Great. And one thing I want to close with some thoughts you might have, because soon we're going to unveil our next most wanted list. And we always get a few people who might say, well, why would you have something on the most wanted list where there are 154 tragedies when you have, you know, thousands on highways? Why don't you talk about that for a second, Stephanie? And if others want to chime in on how crucial the most wanted list is.
Sure. So, you know, as a multimodal agency, NTSB has a responsibility and a mission to improve transportation for everyone. So while we see many more deaths on our highways, if we just focused on one mode, we'd only be improving safety there. And while, you know, compared to 50,000, 40,000 people, you know, killed across transportation, all crashes and accidents, it's 30, more than 30. But, you know, one life is one too many. And 154 crashes that we have said are preventable is a most wanted list worthy issue.
All right. I wanted to let you all, if you wanted give any closing thoughts. Otherwise, I can close up, but just thought I'd offer. You guys don't get to do this a lot, so don't think about all the people watching. It's okay.
It's, I mean, you know, I've only been here for 8 years, and I've only, you know, went to 7 PTC preventable accidents. I can't imagine when I think of Ruben or Mike or Rob or you know, any of the investigators that have gone over and over and over for decades. It's, you know, it was frustrating, and for me, I can't imagine what it's like for these investigators.
All right. Well, with that, I do want to tell you all that I greatly appreciate all your hard work for the agency. I really looked up to you before I even came to the agency for many years. Bob Chipkovich, you can blame for training me on pipelines, hazmat, and railroad issues for many years before I came here. He was fantastic. But thank you all so much for all your work, for your dedication to the agency. Honestly, if it wasn't for what you do, PTC would have never been a reality. So I really want to thank each and every one of you. And I do also want to once again thank Leah Walton for her work on putting this together, for all the folks working on the technical side of things, and then 2 people that work in my office, Eric Strickland and Stephen Stadius, for all their hard work. So thank you all so much for joining me and putting this together. Congratulations for a job well done.